Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this session, and thanks for those who already joined online. Very warm welcome. So in this session, we want to discuss how the UK industry can be decarbonized while maintaining competitiveness. As you can, we need to do this as part of the transition to net zero, but we need also to ensure that our sectors remain competitive compared to their international counterparts. As you can know, the industry sector is contributing to 170 billion per year to the UK economy and is directly employing around 2.6 million jobs. But as you know, the industry sector is highly emitting. Roughly around 16% or more of the total UK emissions is emitted by the industrial sector, and it is seen as one of the very hard sectors to abate because of the heterogeneous processes and other reasons. So with decarbonisation comes different challenges. For example, many low-carbon technologies needed for the processes and sectors are at low development levels, and they are expensive. And therefore, if sectors and firms can invest in those technologies, they're going to increase their production cost, and that's risk their competitiveness. So with this opening, we have three speakers lined up. I'll invite Abby from the Climate Change Committee as our first speaker.
There are lots of people still having their coffee, but we did make an announcement, so maybe
if I want to change the slides.
Yeah, the slides will be sitting, and if you can just go back and next.
Okay.
This slide, and that's it.
Amazing.
Just one thing. You can post your questions via our platform, Glisser. And please also don't forget to vote the most interesting questions as well, so we can take them first. Thank you. Yeah.
Right. Hi everyone. So my name is Abby Thomas. I'm an analyst at the Climate Change Committee. Just going to give you a brief introduction to the challenge of decarbonising UK industry and what basically the CCC has to say on it. So just as to set the scene about industry, I'm basically referring to the manufacturing and construction sectors, and within that we've got iron and steel, cement, chemicals, lime, food and drink, and these obviously contribute massively to the UK economy and to jobs. We've got the stats there that it provides 300 billion to the UK economy and 4 million jobs, which is slightly different to the figures Ahmed just said. It's because I'm including construction as well. And a lot of industry is clustered outside of London and the southeast, so in regions that maybe don't have a lot of other jobs, and industry often provides more high-paying jobs than the regional averages. So obviously it's important to maintain competitiveness in industry, not only for the UK economy, but for the economy of these local places. So in terms of emissions, as Ahmed said, industry emitted 65 megatons of CO2 in 2021, which is 15% of the UK total. So it's not the biggest sector, but it's up there as one of the biggest sectors. And over the longer term, we can see that the emissions have declined quite a lot. So by 1990, they've fallen by 55%. However, you can kind of see that that's kind of been tailing off in the last 10 years. And actually in 2021, the provisional data suggests that emissions have gone back up. So that's probably partly to do with COVID, the longer term disruption, or whether it's a sign of the trends changing. Still a little bit early to say, but in general, kind of slowing of the trend reflects the fact that a lot of the easier energy efficiency type savings have already been kind of achieved. Oh. What did I do? That's not really worked.
So, you want back?
Yeah. That was all for that slide.
is that working okay?
Yeah, I think it's working.
Okay, there's a spare there.
Cool.
Okay.
This slide was supposed to be a map of the UK. I think some of the lines haven't shown up. You can kind of get the impression. Basically, there's 6 key industrial clusters where over half of UK industrial emissions come from. If you know your geography, you can guess where those dots are. Oh, it's gone again. Oh, it's back, it's back. Okay, cool. So we know where industry is, so where does it need to get to? So the CCC's advice, which basically aligns with government's ambition in the sector, is that by 2035, industry needs to reduce its emissions by 70% on 2019 levels. So that's quite a substantial emissions reduction. And you can see from the government pathway, which is the yellow line, that they're actually expecting most of that to come post-2025. So you've got basically a decade there of quite intense emissions reductions. So how are these sectors going to do it? So there's a range of technologies that are available. There's no one-size-fits-all measure. There's no silver bullet. I'll briefly talk through the main technologies. So firstly, we have efficiency measures. This is energy efficiency, so upgrading processes and equipment to more less emissions-intensive modes of operation, and also improving resource efficiency. So that's basically reducing the demand for raw materials, whether through increased recycling and material substitution and that kind of thing. Then we have what's called the deep decarbonization measures, so fuel switching away from fossil-based fuels to low-carbon alternatives, whether that's hydrogen, electricity or bioenergy, and then we also have carbon capture and storage. As you can see in the graph here, that's kind of the CCC's modelling. It's called our balanced net zero pathway for industry. You can see that we see a role for all of these technologies kind of to different extents, and different sectors will require each technology to different extents. So cement, for example, and other processes where CO2 is made from the process rather than combustion, CCS is kind of the only real option there. Cool, just move on. Skip that one. So challenges, there is, as you'd expect, quite a lot of challenges to decarbonising industry. I'll just fly through the first three quite quickly. They're quite self-explanatory. So the costs are high for firms, especially once they've kind of done all they can in terms of energy efficiency, and the next big step is like upgrading their processes and their equipment. And a lot of the technologies, especially sort of talking about hydrogen, CCS, just aren't ready yet, and they're not at a scale to be deployed. So we need like quite rapid deployment of those technologies. And not only that, but especially for hydrogen and CCS, we need the infrastructure to go with that to be ready in time for them to be deployed, which I think government is expecting from about 2025. And then, of course, we also need workers and skills to have the right skills to keep up with that. So I'll come on to sort of the main issue that we're going to be discussing today, and that's competitiveness and carbon leakage. So there's obviously a general concern that stringent environmental policy in the UK is going to impose costs on UK firms and make it harder for them to compete in the global market. Carbon leakage is the idea that production and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with this will be offshored to other jurisdictions where there aren't such strict environmental policies. So there's a couple of ways that policy can mitigate against this. What the UK has been doing so far is free allowances in the emissions trading scheme, but they're consulting on phasing that out probably by 2030. And then there's other policies such as a carbon border adjustment mechanism and product standards, which I'm sure we'll move on to, so I won't discuss those in too much detail. Both of which they're tricky to implement. They need to be consistent with World Trade Organization rules, and they require considerable work developing the accounting methods for embodied emissions within products. So there's some solutions, but they're tricky, as I'm sure we'll discuss more today. So what does the CCC recommend for industry? So I'm going to run through some of our recommendations that we're making in our upcoming progress report, which is going to be published at the end of June. Not in any particular order. So we think the government needs to create a clear incentive for manufacturers outside of the emissions trading scheme. So obviously the ETS is the main policy for industry, but it covers around 2/3 of industrial emissions. So there's still that third of small emitters that aren't covered. So it needs to be a clear incentive for them, and it needs to work for these smaller sites that are often small and medium enterprises. Secondly, data. This is a key point we're making in our report this year. We've been trying being the keyword, to track progress on industrial decarbonisation, and there's just basically a lack of data out there. There's lots of schemes that collect data from firms through various different things, but they're all quite disjointed. It's quite burdensome for firms, so ideally we'd like to see a bit of a reform of industrial data collection so that it's consistent and ideally less burdensome for firms. In terms of specific decarbonisation technologies, we recommend that the government finalises its business models for CCS and hydrogen this year, that it comes up with a similar kind of incentive for electrification. Industrial electrification is something that's kind of on the back burner for the government's plans, but we kind of want to see it get a bit of attention as well, so that there's kind of options available depending on sort of how costs and things develop. And then on efficiency, we want the government to really set out what its ambition is on efficiency and how it sees emission savings being delivered. It's currently a little bit vague. On infrastructure, we recommend that the government finalises its transport and storage business models and launches the next cluster sequencing process. I think the main thing here is to do with timing, so we need CCS and hydrogen to be ready by 2025, ideally to stick to our pathway and to get the emissions reductions that we need by 2035 and onwards. That's not really much time to get the infrastructure in place. Industry is sort of looking to decarbonise, but it needs the kind of clear signals from government. It needs the infrastructure to be built, really. So basically our message is government needs to get on with the infrastructure. And finally, to return to carbon leakage and consumption emissions, we've made a couple of recommendations in this space this year. So we recommend that the government consults on plans to implement CBAMs, so carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and/or mandatory product standards by 2030. They have actually recently announced, I think in the last month or so, that they intend to do this. So that's a good start, but obviously this is a very complex policy area and it will require a lot of development, domestic engagement, international engagement to kind of get where we need to be with that. And again, not to keep banging on about data, but it is an important point. These kind of policies will rely really heavily on data, and in particular an understanding of like the whole life carbon footprint of products and the embodied emissions within products, because ultimately it's our consumption emissions, i.e. the emissions associated with everything we consume, that are important for our environmental goals, not just the things that we produce in the UK. And if production's being moved to other countries but we're still consuming, then ultimately we're not really reaching our environmental goals. And finally, one which I forgot to add to the slide is that we recommend that government continues to engage internationally and encourage other countries to pursue ambitious emissions targets and ambitious environmental policies, basically. Ultimately, one of the drivers of carbon leakage is sort of unequal climate policies across jurisdictions, so one of the key things to mitigate against that is to kind of level the policy playing field. So cool, that's all from me for now. I think I flew through that quite quickly, actually. But hopefully that's given a bit of an insight, an introduction as to what industry needs to decarbonise and some of the challenges. And I'll hand over to Danial or Sam.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks to Abby for this interesting presentation and overview for the sheer challenges for the industrial sector to be decarbonised and the needs for the infrastructure and investment in place and in time needed to decarbonise our industrial sector. For those who just joined recently, can I remind you please just to post your question on Iglissa, our hybrid platform, for the speakers and the panelists to be answered after the speaking session. And can I invite now Dr. Sam Cooper from University of Bath as our next speaker.
Thank you.
Sam.
Brilliant, thanks. Hi everyone. So next sort of 10 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is explore, so we have the cost of decarbonising UK industry. So what might it look like to pay that cost, to sort of pay that in some way. And what I mean by this is we have an estimate, basically based on some of the work that Abby's sort of alluded to there. So we've got an estimate for what it might cost, but there's different ways in which that could be paid and different ways in which it could be spread out. So what might some of those things look like? And really the aim here is to present a few numbers because I feel like I like numbers, and I feel like they can really help to sort of actually contextualize a discussion. So we're going to look at a few numbers around that and what different sort of scenarios might look like, and then sort of draw a few conclusions. But also, actually, we've got a lot of people who are intelligent in this room and are at least sort of interested in some way in this. So we would really appreciate your feedback and your reflections on some of this as we go on. Okay, so so how might the costs of decarbonising UK industry be met? So we don't know the answer really, but we've got three sort of idealised sort of scenarios which we thought we'd consider in terms of providing these numbers. So the first one would be that the companies which are basically decarbonising meet the cost, so they kind of take the hit. So so that basically the cost of decarbonising it, switching to a different technology, would be met from their profit. So that's one sort of set of numbers we can look at. The second set of numbers would be, well, they say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to pass the costs on. So they pass the costs on to their customers, and they pass them on and so on and so on. So essentially, basically, final consumers pay the prices. So essentially, we'd be looking at prices increasing. And the third option would be, well, they say, well, we don't want to take the costs ourselves fully. We like our profits, but also we value our supply chains being as they are, because that also provides us profits. So what we're going to do is a bit of a split. We're going to increase our prices a bit, and then, but not fully. And our customers, they'll do the same. And so essentially, the cost of the decarbonisation gets split along the supply chain. And for this sort of idealised nice scenario, we're going to say that that's in proportion to where the profit's made. So basically where the motivation to maintain that supply chain is. And again, these are just sort of idealised scenarios really for an illustration, so we can look at some numbers and start to get a feel for what this might look like. Before I get on to some sort of results and we can look at some numbers, I just wanted to say, so essentially this estimate of the actual costs, so the sort of starting point for this, is based on, as I mentioned, I didn't really think through that. Abby was going to talk about it, so obviously. But yeah, essentially it's this model called the Enzip Model. And really the one point which I think is worth noting is just that it's coverage. So when I'm talking about these costs, it's the costs of decarbonising UK industry. It doesn't cover the costs of decarbonising transport or electricity or anything like that. So essentially, UK industry on a residential basis is about a quarter of our emissions, and of that quarter, kind of about two-thirds, so about 100 megatons is really is kind of the scope of what we're looking at. It's the cost of decarbonising that 100 megatons. So good-sized chunk, but not all of it by any means. Okay, so first set of results, this is the take-the-hit kind of scenario. And really just, so here we're looking at sort of 2030, 2040, 2050. And so we'd look at sort of what they'd be paying anyway, and then kind of the greeny yellow one, sort of what they pay if they abate their emissions. And so the point of this one, so this is all normalised against the profit made by a whole sector, where we're looking at sort of extraction, food and drink, and so on and so on. And the point here is that actually the costs for their processes are actually already quite a big chunk of, or sort of relative to the profits made within a sector. So the bit which is going to be interesting, which I'll sort of switch to in a minute, is basically what's the difference here. So the difference is essentially the additional cost. But the first point to make is that already we're looking at quite a big cost, whether they abate or not. Okay, so this is then taking, well, so it's the same results, but just expanding it a bit so we can see it to make it a bit more visible. So we're saying this is basically the cost of them abating if they were to take all the cost themselves relative to the profits which they're making at the moment. And that's just to kind of give it a bit of context. And so a couple of points to make here. The first is, actually for a lot of sectors, certainly for the first kind of next couple of decades, within this sort of modelled scenario, we're not looking at massive costs in one sort of objectively, like sort of in absolute terms, we're not looking at massive costs at all. There are, however, within that, a few sectors, and they're really the usual suspects, your sort of energy-intensive industries, metals, chemicals, minerals, where that's basically cement, and so on and so on, where they will need a bit more attention. You can see it's kind of coming up sort of 30, maybe 40% of what they're making at the moment. Okay, so then our second option, we think, well, all the costs are passed down, all the way down the supply chain to final consumers. And here, basically, it kind of spreads that out a bit. And so the sorts of effects we're looking at, well, sort of over the next decade or so, it's not at all, it doesn't even register on here. By sort of 2040, 2050, you can see there's a bit of an increase we would expect, kind of following all those assumptions in this idealized world, on sort of final consumption prices. But actually, if you look at that, well, kind of less than 1%, even in the worst cases for those costs in 2040, maybe sort of a couple of percent for some sectors, purchases from some sectors by 2050. So I think it's tempting to kind of say, well, that's not very much. I mean, that's kind of comparable to, it's actually now less than some of the price rises we've seen over the last kind of year relating to energy and so on. That said, you know, we can't always dismiss things. Like, even though that's kind of a small number in one case, this still reflects quite a lot of changes that people might need to make. So another way we can look at this is, again, it's the same numbers here, but thinking about, well, actually, we have different households, they spend their money on different things. So we just wanted to sort of throw out the numbers in terms of, well, for a different sort of typical household expenditure pattern, like what effect would that have on how much they'd be paying? And so here we're sort of splitting it 10 deciles, so decile 1 being lowest income households, decile 10 being the highest income households. And actually, because different amounts are spent on different sort of categories, it sort of spreads it all out. So you're looking at, well, far less than 1% increase by 2040, and you can see it kind of averages out just a bit less than a percentage increase by 2050. So that first point there is I don't want to be too dismissive, but that feels like quite a low increase, really, relative to everything else which could be happening over the next 30 years. I guess the other point here, which I find interesting, is actually there is a bit of variation across those deciles, between the lowest and the highest income expenditure patterns. But that difference is actually fairly limited. It's not, one of the concerns about this might be, well, we change how much things cost. There are, of course, considerations around the equity of that and how that might pan out. It looks like there's not a whole lot of variation. There is also this interesting thing where I think the higher income groups seem to be spending more on stuff which is imported. So I'll just leave that one there. Okay, so then our third kind of idealized kind of scenario, this is the one where it's kind of all spread out. So basically all the companies take a bit of a hit in terms of their profits, but they maintain their supply chains. And I suppose the reason why this is interesting is to think, well, actually that feels like kind of the sort of thing, something along those lines which might happen. So where would we find some of them which are struggling with that? And you can see these percentages. So this is going through the same 2030, 2040, 2050 effects. And again, this is sort of measured, normalized against basically their profit, their gross surplus. So we're seeing the actual total, like the highest ones are lower than that first graph, where it was kind of up to 30% or something like that. Here we're looking at a hit of up to maybe sort of 7-8% of their gross profit. Although it is, so the first point is actually, realistically, we think that things would be more spread out, or certainly within that kind of way of thinking, there's a good chance it'd be more spread out. But also, it is still kind of concentrated a bit more on those ones which we would have originally thought about, the high energy, energy-intensive kind of sectors, the minerals, well, chemicals, and then minerals where there's also process emissions. Yeah, so there's a few numbers there. And so, just quickly to sort of wrap up, as I say, so the aggregate costs we're looking at there already, I mean, the initial numbers, sort of high in absolute terms, like if you look at like £1 billion or whatever, but actually relative to the size of the economy and other things which are happening, the numbers are quite manageable. That said, though, this is aggregating things at a sector, and so there is a danger there, I think, of missing that within those sectors, sort of big sort of aggregations, we could mask that there are actually some significant vulnerabilities within them. And so there is still, even if we can look at it and say, well, it's affordable, which is certainly true, within that there are things which we need to be taking a bit more care of. And so, yeah, as I say, some sectors may need a bit more help there. Looking at that, even on that third scenario, we saw sort of the really high costs relate to these energy-intensive sectors. So when we talk about carbon border adjustment mechanism and things like that, certainly my understanding is the initial focus may be on some of those sectors. And actually this supports that as an idea, that actually by focusing on some of those, we actually capture, we kind of address most of the issues. So that may be a valid way ahead. Again, there was this issue about sort of how changing people's expenditure may affect things overall. And we feel like actually it doesn't look like that's a big problem. But of course, that's something to keep an eye on. And then finally, a point which I kind of skipped over there, but that actually within those costs, there's actually the costs are basically the net of a saving on efficiency, energy and resource efficiency, and then also an additional cost of other abatement sort of options. And so those are really, I guess the point is, those are important. Those efficiency measures actually are important, both in terms of saving carbon, but also sort of mitigating some of the costs. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Many thanks, Sam. And I think the pass it on option is really difficult for us in this, cost of living crisis that we are facing. And with that, I think I'll invite our third speaker, Dr. Danial from Energy System Catapult.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's just next. Morning, everyone. Yes, I'm Daniel Sturge. I'm Carbon Policy Practice Manager at the Catapult, and some of you are probably asking who are the Catapult, so I will start off with that. So we were set up, there's a kind of whole network of catapults, and we focus on the energy system, as the name suggests. We're based in Birmingham, and really we're there to kind of help solve the challenges that are associated with the energy system, and we take what we call a whole systems approach. So I sit in the policy team, but we look at it from modelling, consumer insight, infrastructure and engineering, technology, so really looking at the challenge from all the different angles. So I'm going to talk about the kind of policy mechanisms that we can use to mitigate competitive impacts and carbon leakage, but I want to start off with a definition between the two, just so to make sure we're on the same page. So the kind of competitiveness impacts that arise, this is really the capacity and ability for a firm to gain and maintain a profitable, sustainable market share relative to rivals. Now, carbon policy, and I'll kind of go into what I mean when I'm talking about carbon policies in a minute, this can impact competitiveness, but not carbon policy doesn't have all the impacts. So things like labour cost considerations, the kind of resource, how close you are to your customer base, these all have different impacts on ability to be competitive. But specifically when we're talking about carbon policies, this may put a firm at a disadvantage with their international peers. So these are the firms that we're talking about today, the ones that can't pass on those costs. Because they're competing with international peers who don't see those same carbon policies. And so as a result of that, competitive impacts can result in carbon leakage. And these are the impacts that leads to emissions reduction here kind of domestically, because there's an increase in emissions globally. And this is the result of investment leakage, so we're choosing not to invest in the UK, but also firms relocating outside, so offshoring. So just wanted to kind of make clear those two definitions. Hopefully agree, because I think there's a little bit of contention on what these things can mean. So obviously this is not a new area for policy. Government fund and subsidise industry to the tune of about £1.8 billion per year, and this is spread over kind of three broad areas. About £1 billion of those pounds are coming through free allowances in UK ETS. And obviously as the prices continue to increase in the UK ETS, then that kind of subsidy amount will also increase. The amounts that the kind of energy intensive, so i.e. the electricity costs that some industries seen, the relief they get in terms of subsidy is about close to £500 million, and that's actually been doubled for this year, as confirmed, due to the ongoing cost of electricity and energy. And the final pot of money, which looks small in comparison, but still £300 million a year, is through climate change agreements. So these are kind of energy efficiency type measures that industry agrees with government to reduce their climate change levy bill. So we're subsidising industry quite a lot already, and as a result we've not seen much carbon leakage because of that, and I think CCC did a great report on this a few years ago, which explored that. So free allowances is kind of that main policy mechanism in place at the moment. And government have actually been quite quiet on what's going to replace that and what that might look like going forward. Now, obviously, there's a consultation, which I'm sure many of you are aware at the moment, looking at developing the UK ETS, and government are consulting on that. And that the review of free allocation, but notably within it, there's kind of a lack of what's coming next. We can review what a policy looks like, but what follows is about as crucial as what the policy is going to do. And in Treasury's net zero review last year as well, they were there's some signs that there's some thoughts churning within government, but again, very quiet on what that looks like. As Abby mentioned as well, that we did hear recently the Financial Secretary to the Treasury announced that they're going to be consulting on CBAMs and product standards crucially later in the year. Again, it's a good start, and better late than never, but it feels like it really should have come earlier in the year when we're talking about all these other things, developing UK ETS in particular. Right, so now I'm going to talk about the kind of policies. So these kind of next couple of slides I'm going to talk through is built on a report I wrote for the Climate Change Committee ahead of their 6th carbon budget advice in 2020. And it's really looking at the policy mechanisms that we can implement to mitigate competitiveness impacts and carbon leakage, but also crucially that allows deep decarbonisation in line with net zero for industry. So we're not just about protecting industry; it's also decarbonising industry, and I think that's the real crucial step in the kind of pathway to net zero. So I'm going to sit on the slide. There are some lines missing, but pretend there's things around these, so they're kind of different bubbles. Fundamentally, the kind of mechanism that you use to mitigate competitive impacts or carbon leakage depends on the underlying carbon policy that is there in place at the moment. And we can think about this as being divided into three sections. So I'll just go through them each and kind of describe what that means and how they work with those carbon policies. So the first one, which is something we at the Energy Systems Catapult have really been pushing, is the role of carbon standards. There's a number of reasons we think carbon standards have a really important role to play in policy. One predominantly being that while there is a role for carbon pricing, the kind of ability to implement a carbon price which is strong enough to by itself incentivise decarbonisation in line with net zero, as we kind of witness globally and within the UK, is very difficult. I mean, the carbon price support's been frozen at £18 per tonne since its implementation. And so we see there's a role for carbon standards. And by carbon standards, it's kind of the similar approach we have on food standards, where if you don't meet a minimum, then you're not allowed to trade in this country. Similar approach to carbon. If you're producing a certain amount of above the carbon standard, then you can't trade that kind of product in the country. And there's a couple of ways of implementing that. There's the mandatory minimum requirement, which is, maybe not the snappiest name, but it's suggesting that you're kind of meeting that minimum standard of carbon. You're not emitting above it for the product, and that you're trading with in the UK. And crucially, this can be applied at the border as well. So I'll come back to this point in a second. But it also can be applied on purchases. So this is very much linked to a point I'll come later on, which is the low carbon public procurement process. And then there's something which is slightly a bit more novel, which is the idea of flexible compliance. So if you, for example, don't meet the standard, you can kind of buy your way out of it by paying a carbon price, for example. So it can be also implemented in tangent with a carbon price, and this may be as a kind of a useful way to transition to a more stronger carbon price that would be useful later as we head towards 2050. The middle section is carbon pricing, so these are the ones we're probably most familiar with and the ones that are used today more broadly. We've got carbon tax and rebates. So, for example, the kind of, if you're paying the climate change levy, you can get a rebate on that. We're doing it through climate change agreements, and you can also get exemptions, so you don't have to pay it at all. The cap and trade free allocation of allowances. So this is what we use in the UK ETS. This is a pretty standard process for mitigating carbon leakage. And finally is the kind of border carbon adjustment mechanism, CBAMs. Obviously, this is something that's a pretty hot topic at the moment, and we see as a potential avenue, but again, there's some really difficult issues to solve around that, and it's an untested process. So should we be considering other ideas as well as we're pursuing this? And finally is the kind of thing that we've used a lot today as well, so carbon subsidies. Our direct funding at the bottom, that's the one we obviously see most at the moment, and this can be funding technologies or just kind of providing funding for electricity costs, etc. Carbon contracts of difference are quite a popular option at the moment, especially in the near term. Obviously, we've seen quite a lot of success in the offshore wind industry for using CFDs. I think my kind of general maybe concern around CFDs is what's the long-term plan? How do you get out of that mechanism to stop kind of just funneling money into industry and using a lot of kind of public funded money to support that? So definitely potential in the near term, but how do you transition to that out of the long term? And there's also a way for government to kind of lead the way through low carbon public procurement. We see this in other jurisdictions. So California has a thing, so any kind of public infrastructure, if you're getting cement, then it has to meet certain standards. So could government lead the way in terms of procurement on the big infrastructure projects in particular, and kind of grow lead markets within the UK? So these are kind of the options we analyse, and if you want to read the very wordy long report with a few charts, then it goes into a lot more detail on the kind of pros and cons of those. But what we did from that then was kind of digest that and then think about, well, what's the timeline? What could we see between now to 2050? That kind of crucial question of, if we were at free allowances now and direct funding, where does that go to in 2050 and how do we transition there? And I think the kind of main takeaway of this is there's no single policy that's going to work. We can't just have a carbon tax. The UK ETS by itself is not going to solve all the problems. We need a mix of policy. And I think this is particularly crucial because the sectors in which we call industry vary so widely, be it where they're based, the kind of, if they're in clusters, dispersed, the type of products they're offering, if they're trade exposure, if they're not, etc., and the opportunity to fuel switch as well. So this is kind of a very broad timeline. It's not specific to any policy, any sector, but I think it kind of shows the journey of what policy could look like. So if we're kind of here at the moment, direct funding and free allowances, this is something that would want to phase out over time. So it's probably going to stick around for the next decade, but it's something when you think about phasing out. And then the kind of policies in the kind of nearer to middle term are things like potentially carbon contracts for difference, so a bit more sophisticated way of funding industry, ensuring outcomes and not just kind of throwing money at the problem, and the role of procurement as well. I've put here UK ETS linked CBAMs. Now this was written a couple of years ago, and I think my view slightly changed on the ability for this to happen in the time frame that I put here. And I actually think the role of standards should come a bit closer. But crucially, I think what this is saying is that we need to start thinking about these things now, even though their implementation, especially at the border where we're talking about today, might not come for another decade or 2 decades. And also, we need a mix of policies. Just to reiterate, these are all things that need to kind of happen together. And I think what's really important, and something we think about a lot at the Energy Systems Catapult, is how they interact with one another. So we shouldn't be implementing policies in isolation. We should be thinking about how they interact with the wider policy landscape and then what's coming next after that. So that's it from me. Any questions other than today, do feel free to email me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think you showed that urgent carbon policy is needed for the industry from now in order to meet our decarbonisation targets. Now I would like to invite our 3 speakers with our panelists. Anna Musat, which is from Aldersgate Group, and also Dr. Julian Gregory, who will be joining us online to take some, couple of questions and, begin the discussion. So can you please come here, Sam? So can I invite Anna, please, to introduce yourself and open the discussion for this panel session.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, and hello, everyone. So I'm Anna Musat. I'm the head of policy at Aldersgate Group. Just a bit of background to Aldersgate Group for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We're an alliance of cross-economy businesses and civil society organizations, and we work with our members to make the business case for ambitious climate and environmental policy, whilst at the same time developing policy solutions and testing them with our business members. So we work right across the economy. When it comes to industry, we have some manufacturers, some heavy industry players and cement, chemicals in our membership, but we also work with sectors such as finance to really look across the board and make sure that the recommendations we make work across the economy. I think in terms of decarbonizing industry and maintaining competitiveness, we've been doing quite a bit of work on this over the past couple of years, looking at a range of issues such as industrial electricity prices, product standards, and a lot of the tools that you've heard about today already. I think there's a really strong recognition from government that we really need to decarbonize industry, and we need to do it in such a way that maintains its competitiveness. Because as Abby highlighted in her presentation, there's a lot of important benefits in terms of job creation, can help with the levelling up agenda, and there's also an opportunity for us to secure some of these supply chains that have been really hit during the pandemic and with the latest geopolitical events that are unfolding. I think to make sure that we maintain competitiveness, we need a range of carrots and sticks. I think the sticks are definitely in place for now because we've got really high carbon prices under the UK ETS. We've got really high gas prices and energy prices, which are really strengthening the rationale to decarbonising. But at the same time, we need to recognize that a lot of these industries are facing really high capital expenditure in order to move to net zero. So we need to make sure that the ability to invest really is there. And Daniel mentioned some of the direct subsidies that are already in place. I think that's a great start. But I totally agree that we need to move on from direct subsidies in the longer term and really make sure that we create the markets and grow the demand for those low carbon industrial products. So I think just a couple of things that I'd highlight in terms of policy. One of them, which is quite fundamental, is looking at this issue of industrial electricity prices, because the business case for electrification is quite weak, but also if we want to move down the CCS green hydrogen route, we also need cheap and plentiful renewables. So actually, even before the gas crisis, we were already seeing high industrial electricity prices in the UK compared to continental Europe. So having some sort of industrial strategy that looks at how we recover costs across the network, how we create these consortia that can enter into more attractive power purchase agreements could be some really important tools. And then obviously, as we look to build more transmission infrastructure, looking at how we build that most effectively. And then the second thing, I would say, again, reiterating some of the points that the other speakers have made around the role of growing the demand for low-carbon products. So looking at mandatory product standards and rationing these up over time. Looking at carbon is one really good way to start, but then we also need to think about embodied emissions, life cycle emissions, and all of that. And then also the use of procurement, because having that certainty of demand can really mobilize investment. As we've seen, for example, in the case of Sweden and the hybrid low-carbon steel project, where the certainty of demand was one of the reasons why the project went ahead a bit quicker. And then final point I'd like to make is just obviously a lot of the industry activity in the UK is clustered, but we also have half of the emissions coming from outside of those industrial clusters. So having a clear plan for how we roll out the infrastructure to those dispersed sites and how we accelerate their journey to net zero is also really important. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. This is a very interesting perspectives that you mentioned. Now I turn to Julian. Can you hear us hopefully online?
Well, can you hear me? That's the important thing.
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, excellent. Right. Sorry, I was expecting to be with you today. However, I caught COVID last week during attending another conference, and well, I didn't want to pass it on, so hence you're seeing me in my current isolation room here. Anyway. In terms of how I fit into the picture, so I'm currently working on one of the projects, part of the Industrial Decarbonisation Research Innovation Centre, IDRIC, you might be familiar with. And I'm currently working on a project with low carbon reorientation in steel, oil refining and the chemicals industries. And I'm working on that along with Frank Giels from the University of Manchester. I'm also at the University of Manchester. I was formerly at the University of Sussex. I was going to sort of give a bit of a discuss some feedback on the three presentations. However, I'm afraid the volume got muted for Abby's presentation. I missed most of it, and it's a little bit difficult to sort of pick up on. I did pick up on things, but I think it's probably better that I take a slightly different approach in a way that I hope will add to the debate and add to the questions. What I've seen from the talk so far is perspectives are very, very important here. And I want to try and give an industry's perspective to explain what's going on, or try and get you to think about this differently by trying to understand how industries might be looking at this. Particularly bearing in mind when we're looking at the high carbonising industries as having a lot of foreign ownership. So I want to first of all start off with what I think is an important factor that is often not fully appreciated. How difficult is it for these industries to change? Bearing in mind, these are politically important industries from the government's perspective, but the owners of these industries have quite a bit of power, and often the trade unions have a lot of influence too. And I think this needs to be appreciated because it makes change difficult. My background, or my immediate research, is concentrated on steel, and I can tell you now that the unions, for instance, have had a particular bearing over the years on how easy it is for change to occur. These are industries with huge legacy factors. So again, if I take the steel industry in the UK would not look like it does now if it hadn't come from where it came from. If you were to build a steel industry from scratch in the UK, it would look different to the one we actually have. These industries have lock-ins. They have a certain way of doing things, they have supply chains. It is costly for them to change the way that they do things. And we need to appreciate the lock-ins that determine the way that these industries operate. They're also large employers with relatively high-paying jobs. So if we start messing around with where these industries are located, etc., it has a big bearing on the locations where those industries are located. And equally, finally, they're obviously large users of energy, and they have no control over how much that energy, or they have not as much control as they would like over what that cost of energy is. So we need to appreciate all these things when we're trying to understand why industry is going to do what it is. And bear in mind, I have an investment banking background. If we expect these industries to invest, will it be worth their while, particularly if they're foreign owned? It's all very well saying, look, you have to pay for this, but will it be worth their while? Now, not wishing to bore you, any of you, I want you to think about an investment a bit like as follows. A definition for an investment is to incur an immediate cost in the expectation of receiving a future reward. And we cannot expect these industries to invest in decarbonisation if they don't think they will be able to be rewarded sufficiently for making that investment. So hopefully I've given everybody some things to think about here in terms of maybe stimulating some further questions. I hope that's added to the richness of the debate.
Thank you very much, Julian, for listing those barriers. I think this gives like a lot of perspectives and context into industrial decarbonisation. Now I'll turn into the questions and ask our panel some of the questions so we can kick out the discussion. The first question, which is the most voted one, what more do we need to do to decarbonize dispersed industrial sites, given that they are emitting half or more of our industrial emissions, and of course they are not accessing the same infrastructure as compared to cluster sites? Can I begin with Anna, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I think really important to be talking about dispersed sites, and I think as we make the plans for industrial decarbonisation, it's really important to factor them in from the get-go. With some technologies like hydrogen and CCS, it makes sense to start in clusters because you can achieve economies of scale much quicker, and it's easier to deploy that infrastructure. So completely understand that approach, but at the same time, some certainty on how this infrastructure is going to be rolled out is really important. If you think about it for example, for a cement player, they're already thinking about the investments that they need to make in the run-up to 2050, and the decisions around infrastructure can't be made on such short notice. So having clarity around if they're going to access CCS infrastructure, how is that going to work, what sort of transport are we looking at, what sort of hydrogen infrastructure is going to be rolled out to them, that's really critical. So I think certainty on infrastructure is one thing. There's another potential avenue for reducing emissions, which is around resource and material efficiency. And I think a lot of companies in dispersed sites are really quite interested in this because it's something that they can start doing now, and something that's been quite useful in the past, and two of our members have worked together on this, was this concept of industrial symbiosis, where basically government was acting as a matchmaker to kind of bring the waste of one organization or one sector and reintegrate it in the production process of a different sector. So we had two members, Cemex and Suez, who are the waste management company, that were working together to basically produce from waste a lower carbon substitute for clinker in cement production. So that was really helpful for Cemex, helping them to lower emissions, really helpful for Suez to kind of divert some of the waste from landfill. So looking at some of those potential industrial partnerships could be really helpful, and there's, I think, still a lot of scope to continue doing that today.
Thank you. Abby?
So I think Anna covered loads of the really important points there. A plan for infrastructure is obviously key, and something we're recommending in our report this year is that government sets out a plan for infrastructure from dispersed sites. I guess if they're not going to rely on these technologies that need such like established infrastructure, then there's obviously the resource efficiency and the electrification options, but kind of something that we flagged is that they're not quite getting the same attention. So just developing options on industrial electrification and a bit more clarity on resource efficiency and energy efficiency should work to help those dispersed sites and smaller sites. And potentially a bit of more work might be needed to, specifically on dispersed sites, looking at what's most cost effective there, because there are transport options like shipping and like trucking of hydrogen and things that may work out to be cost effective, and they don't need to be linked to the cluster infrastructure, but potentially there's room for some more research there to basically set out now what we think will be the options, so that they can get the ball rolling.
Thank you. And Daniel?
Yeah, so actually we published a paper quite recently thinking about what is the role of clusters for wider industrial decarbonisation, because a lot of the kind of, as we've heard, the mechanisms in place at the moment are focused at clusters. How can we ensure we leverage that investment into clusters so it works for the wider industry? And obviously the kind of challenges are quite different, but I think there's potential learnings that could be passed on. So I think the kind of the policy framework needs to be considered in that as the industry is around. Recognising where we're starting from and where that can go going forward. I think another really kind of just picking up maybe a point that's not been covered yet is the role of planning as well. When we've got kind of dispersed sites, they're obviously integral kind of parts to local communities as well as clusters. And so what is the role of planning, energy planning in particular, for developing decarbonisation pathways for those dispersed sites? And I think going forward, when you're thinking about how you decarbonise a site, then you can also consider what the energy requirements for that. So then that leads on to options for decarbonising the local community in terms of heat decarbonisation, transport decarbonisation, and the wider economy as well.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, isn't it? It's a difficult one. I guess just only other thought in addition to some of those other points is so longer term. I mean process-based emissions, which are decentralised, are very difficult. For some of the sort of energy-based ones, I guess just the technology readiness levels and improving the confidence in those. There's just like a long lead time in terms of establishing kind of commercial confidence and then being able to implement them with a sort of natural sort of rollover and lifespan of equipment. That all just takes a long time to do effectively. So trying to improve confidence in some of these alternatives as quickly as possible, I think, is
Thank you. And last but not least, Julian, do you have any perspective on dispersed sites?
If you could just repeat the question, because after this is the other four talk.
Yeah. So we are talking about the dispersed industrial sites that are covering like half, responsible for half or more for the UK emissions. So how can they decarbonize while maintaining their competitiveness?
Okay, I think we need to appreciate two approaches here. Firstly, we can look at this in an incremental basis using technologies that we understand. So, the simplest, on the assumption the electricity industry itself decarbonizes, which I think we can agree is likely to happen with the level of renewable generation that's going on. So we can focus on incremental improvements based on using electricity. And the advantages about that approach is, of course, it's a lower risk approach because electricity is far better, is well understood as a technology. Bearing in mind the nature of these high energy using industries, hydrogen is often talked about, but I stress here, never underestimate the complexity of new technologies. And it's all very well and good saying, let's just replace it with hydrogen. In my experience, complexity always comes back to bites us, and it'll be a lot more challenging using an unproven technology than it will be using a proven one.
Thank you very much. There were some discussion about like how we can mitigate carbon leakage and CBAM design. So I'll ask Danial, please. So what is your opinion about if the UK implements like its CBAM strategy? And I would like to add also to the questions, like if the UK didn't introduce CBAM, how like the EU introduction of CBAM would affect that, given that our main trading partner is the EU for both export and imports?
Yeah, it is. Don't have an answer of how it could be designed because I think that's going to be incredibly difficult. I think there's a few things to consider. One is the UK is playing catch up a little bit, so the EU are way ahead of us in terms of actually thinking about this and how it could be implemented for them. And as you rightly point out, they're kind of our main trading partner, and so if we're going to develop a policy and implement it ourselves, it should either be looking to align with that, or at least we should be working with the EU to ensure that whatever we develop works both ways. And I think that's a key thing. I just want to kind of take back to what I was talking about, the role of standards and CBAMs from a pricing perspective. Did publish a blog post on this. If you want to look at my Twitter, it explains it in a bit more detail because I suspect I'm going to forget some stuff. But the kind of underlying difficulty for both is data, and this goes to Abby's point that we need data, and it's not just data here in the UK, it's globally we need the data. Being able to rely on the kind of reported of emissions and how you verify that from other jurisdictions is going to be really difficult, but that's going to be driving whether the kind of organisations that we're importing in the UK are meeting the requirements for the standard of CBAM. And that's an issue that crosses both, and so the challenges are similar. What changes is the implementation, how you kind of put the incentive in place, so be it a price or kind of using that minimum so you can trade within the UK. So I think there's kind of that consideration of, well, if we're going to get through this, how do we get the data? The other thing is the kind of political economy I don't think should be underestimated within this. Actually, the kind of difficulty, data aside, is the politics of it all. We're talking about going into the realm of trade policy, which is obviously a pretty hot topic at the moment. And we're already seeing kind of those things being watered down a little bit from an environmental perspective until we get trade deals in place. And so there's a risk that we're not even going to kind of meet that first starting point from CBAM. And the final point is, excuse me, the kind of WTO rules and eligibility on all of this. This is, again, a completely untested territory for trade and the kind of rules. And so it's going to be a long lead time. So we need to start kind of simple and not trying to make it perfect initially. And then longer term, we develop that over time, working as Anna said at the start, with kind of the kind of trade points and international colleagues as well on this.
Thank you very much. Ari, if you would like to comment from a policy perspective on CBAM?
Yeah, so maybe I'll pick up a bit about the design difficulties. They're going to be really difficult to design. There's a trade-off that we'll see in practice between how environmentally effective they are and then how we can actually implement them practically. So obviously, in an ideal world, you would know the emissions embodied in every product and you could implement them on that, but we don't have that kind of understanding of the emissions embodied in products. So we're going to have to think about how this data is going to be collected, what classes are sort of low emission, what kind of level of granularity would be used. Would you look at every single product in isolation? Would you look at the sector-based averages? If you look at averages, what about that person who's done a really low, low emissions version, and how are they benefiting from this policy? So there's all these different things to think about. I think the general opinion seems to be that we'd start with kind of sector-based averages. But yeah, it's going to be a really tricky thing to balance, because obviously the aim of all of this is to reduce our emissions. So if we end up with such a watered-down version that it's not really doing that, then we haven't solved the problem. So I haven't really answered the question. I've just thrown up more questions. But yeah, that's definitely something that needs to be. A lot of work's going to need to be done.
Thank you, and Anna?
Yeah, I would agree with the points that have been made so far. I think it's a really tricky instrument to implement, and if we just look at the pains that the EU has gone through trying to bring it to a sort of feasible proposal, I think we can kind of agree from the start that it's not going to be something that we can implement in the short term. So I would say it's really important not to put all of our eggs into the CBAM basket, and also look at some other mechanisms in the meantime. CBAM is effectively a way to protect domestic producers from high carbon imports. To me, what's more important is to create a market, and to create the right incentives for everyone to be moving along on the journey. So that's where procurement comes in, that's where product standards come in. And just one final point that I'd like to add on CBAM is the point around global justice, because to the EU proposals, some challenges have been raised around, are we effectively just pricing less developed countries out of EU markets, which is a pretty important point. And yeah, actually, if you think about it, we might be doing just that. So really important, if we go down the CBAM route, to also think about how we can sort of compensate some of those countries or help them transition their industries as well. In the EU, there have been some talks about hypothecating some of the revenue from CBAM and using it for climate finance, which would be really important because we still haven't met our goal that we pledged ages ago.
Thank you very much. And related to that, I think there's a question in the chat about the importance of international cooperation and increase the global climate ambition, because what we have seen in the COP, as the question says, the most the heavy or the most industrial nations like China, they emit more, but then they have less ambitious climate policy. So how important is international cooperation in order, for example, not to break WTO rules from introducing CBAM or other measures to industrial decarbonization? Anyone can answer this.
Yeah, I can. I mean, I think it's fundamental. I think, and going down this point earlier about the kind of carrot and stick, the stick of CBAMs, it does need to be supported by the carrot of international cooperation, and recognising that the high emitting industries going forward will be from jurisdictions and countries which are just going through their fossil fuel industrial revolutions. And so this whole idea of a just transition doesn't just apply within the UK, it's a global thing, and bringing everyone along for that journey is going to be really important. Otherwise we're kind of just going to get into the politics of decarbonisation, and the emissions aren't going to reduce as quickly as we need them to reduce.
Thank you very much. And for Abby, there's a question. Do you see a future without the heavy industries such as steel and cement?
In the UK?
In the UK.
I guess, well, obviously we're aiming, what we're discussing today is obviously maintaining that competitiveness in the UK. And I guess some people might say, well, maybe the UK is just not meant to have these industries. If it's more competitive for them to be elsewhere, then they should be elsewhere. I don't think that's sort of what that's definitely not the avenue we're going down. We want to maintain competitiveness, and the UK does have comparative advantage in certain industries, and obviously where we have a comparative advantage, we want to continue that we're not sort of hampered by our climate goals. I guess something that I don't think we've really touched on, especially when we're talking about the demand for like low carbon products, is new markets that are coming in terms of like producing our wind turbines and producing the goods that we need for a low carbon economy. And I think obviously we definitely want the UK to be at the forefront of that, and it obviously has some of the skills and the manufacturing basis that could be needed for that. And I think, as I flagged earlier, the point about the regional clustering of industry is really important. If we were just to say, fine, let the steel industry be offshore, then I don't think there'd be huge amounts of local communities in South Wales and in Scunthorpe, I think the other big iron producing places, that what would we do then? They're big employers in the region, and it's really important for those local communities. So I think we want to try and maintain the competitiveness there.
Okay, many thanks, Abby. For some, there are two probably separate questions. But do your projected costs assume large industries continue to use fossil fuels with CCS, or a major technology change like electrification? And what do you think is the best mechanism to separate the decarbonisation cost? Is it via, for example, VAT reduction? So the first question is, do you project cost?
Yeah. The second one.
The second one is, what is the best mechanism to separate the decarbonisation cost?
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So first one's easy in terms of we're using this other model as the source of the kind of the costs. We were just interested in just getting a few numbers together in terms of if it was spread out in different ways, what does that look like, so we can have the conversation. So the Enzip model, which is being used by a bunch of people, it includes fossil fuel prices. It includes a whole lot of different things, and there's details on that, which is probably just easier to look at some of those details. But yes, to those specific questions. In terms of how you would spread out the costs, I guess that's kind of the point, is that there's a bunch of different policies that Danial was sort of giving a few examples of. But essentially, I suppose we could differentiate between things which change the costs. Potentially, you could do something which enables market inefficiencies to be kind of removed or reduced. A large part of this, though, would be just, if we've got these costs and we need to do them, how there's different ways we can do that, different policies that can affect the extent to which those different ways in which the costs are spread out. Just what do they look like? So whether that's VAT or whatever else is kind of a bit of a separate thing. I mean, VAT would a VAT based on the carbon price. I mean, I suspect it'd be better to apply it at source, but that's kind of a bit of a different.
Thank you very much, Sam. The other question is that the Mayor of Manchester was here yesterday, and he stressed the importance of local authorities. So there's a question: who should have a role in facilitating local industrial decarbonisation? This can be local authorities or local enterprise partnerships, or maybe some kind of a new kind of organisation to facilitate this further. So can I ask any, starting from Anna, please?
Yeah, I think there's a really important role for local players, of course. I think especially when we consider those dispersed sites as well, and how we integrate them into the industrial decarbonisation policy. When it comes to local energy planning, as Daniel mentioned, it's really important to be aware of the specificities and realising what's going to work and what's not going to work from a planning perspective. And the local authorities, local enterprise partnerships are really well placed to comment and advise on that. For example, there's a few cement plants around the country that are located next to areas of outstanding natural beauty. So again, thinking of how are we going to get the CCS infrastructure, the hydrogen infrastructure in place, because it's unlikely that we're going to get very quick planning permission to build around those areas. I think that's really key. And also, I think at the local level, it's really important to also bring some of those businesses together. we have those. So we have the main clusters that Abby showed on her slide with the geography test for you all. But actually, there's a few other areas where there's a lot of clustered industrial activity. So. The extent to which some of those qualify to be clusters or apply to be clusters or not is also down to the local authority, local enterprise partnership. And I think, yeah, just kind of cluing them up and including them more into the national policy making and ensuring that dialogue is going to be really key.
Thank you very much. Abby?
Yeah, I agree. I think local authority and local planning can be quite fragmented, and it's not necessarily joined up to kind of national planning and kind of government's thinking. So, yeah, for example, there's infrastructure needs around like the High Net cluster, that's sort of in the Merseyside area, where they're facing barriers from like local planning, permission kind of things, because then they don't necessarily agree with the infrastructure. There's like beautiful countryside and they don't want to disturb, and it's just kind of maybe a bit of a lack of a join up between how these individual planning processes fit into our kind of national picture of what infrastructure we need. And I don't think we have a particularly clear plan of like an infrastructure plan, say, for the country, and I think that would involve a lot of different actors at sort of every single level, and that would be, yeah, really important to kind of get those local authorities involved and sort of understanding the bigger picture.
Yeah, and Daniel, your perspective on?
Yeah, I think I just kind of reiterate the Abby and Anna, the kind of, with central government are really good at the big stuff, and that's what they're there for, to deal with the big stuff. And local government are really good at the small stuff that they know in their areas, and we need to kind of join those two together. So it's not kind of either or. I think it's a how do you work together? But we can't put too much pressure on local authorities because they kind of don't have that power, and they don't have the authority at the moment to kind of do those things that link to the big stuff. So there needs to be a process in which by local authorities are empowered to be able to make those decisions in kind of with those wider infrastructure and economy-wide decisions in place. I mean, I think a really useful example to think about is we're right near the Peak District. There's a cement works right in the middle of it. That's kind of how do you decarbonise something that's in a national park, which is crucial to the local community in terms of jobs. That's both a very local problem and a national problem, and I don't think either can make the decisions and solve it themselves. And so how do you join those dots together?
Thank you very much. And for Julian, there's questions like open questions, do we have to accept like some of our industrial sectors are just not viable to be decarbonized, and we as such create a new space for new industries?
Ooh, that's a bit neoliberal to me. Look, the easiest thing in the world to say is let's deindustrialize and make it somebody else's problem. And that's all we're doing if we do that. It's making it somebody else's problem, because if we take steel, if the steel industry doesn't exist in the UK anymore, we're still going to need steel. So I personally think we need to look at this differently. I think we've got to say, are there opportunities that decarbonisation offer that we could potentially leverage? So, for instance, from the steel perspective, I think there are huge opportunities for us to redefine what our steel industry is, as an example. Why do we make primary steel in this country? When I say primary steel, I'm talking about taking iron ore, which is probably coming from Brazil, and using coal, which is certainly not coming from the UK. Both these industries we used to produce these domestically, but we don't anymore. So taking coal, maybe from Australia, and making the primary steel here. Why don't we concentrate on recycling scrap steel and have a new steel industry based around that, as an example, and redefine and work on redefining the supply lines for scrap steel. So I would say we should say, are there what advantages can or what opportunities can decarbonisation offer, and find ways to leverage those rather than just throw our hands up and say it's somebody else's problem.
Many thanks indeed, Julian. So I'll leave it here, and I conclude our session. There's only 5 minutes separating us from the lunch, so that's it. And I would like to thank everybody here, and also our speakers and Julian, who is joining online. Thank you very much.